Hey, everybody, welcome to the Writing Room. So glad you're with us. And this is a place where we talk about words, but we also talk about the meaning behind the words and the people behind the words. And I'm with my co-host, Kimberly. Stuart. Kim, how are you today?
Hello, so great to be here. Happy to be here with you, Bob, and with our guest.
Yeah, this can be awful fun because Paul Young is with us, and he's just a good egg. If you haven't read one of his books, Welcome to Earth, he's just done such a great job. Not only is an accomplished writer, but he's just a good friend. I remember showing up in Portland. I was speaking somewhere and they said, "This is where you're going to stay tonight." And instead of finding some Best Western somewhere, it felt like a residential area and there was an address. And so it's kind of late at night. And I walk up, I open the door, and it's Paul.
That's
Okay,
awful.
you are a prankster too. Paul, welcome.
I am so honored to be here. And as you know, every conversation ends up being a two-way street. Yeah.
Oh boy, I'll tell you, after Paul had written The Shack, which I no doubt we'll talk about a little bit, we have a place up in Canada, and in the shack, Paul wrote a letter, a little note to one of my sons. And we still have that shack, and it was time to stain or do something. I'm like, don't even think about it.
Yeah, what an honor. It escaped the fire.
It did. It did. There's a story in there somewhere. And Paul also has withstood. We have kind of a tradition up at the lodge before somebody leaves. We'll get a little rope and then we light both ends of it and we squish them together. And then I burn off my fingerprints. I could break into anybody's house. I have no fingerprints left. Um, uh, but we're here to talk about a little bit about the writing process and tell us, Paul, some of your adventure when it comes to writing. Some people know your story and a few don't. So it would be really helpful for those that are aspiring to write or that are in the middle of writing to talk about how it came to pass that you ended up being so well known.
Yeah. So I never intended to be a published author. Let's get that right out there. And I also never took a writing class. But when I was growing up, which was overseas, I learned to write by reading good writers. So I read a lot of the classics, and it taught me how to use language. And so reading classics was a way to get out of my world at the time, which was pretty traumatic. And then I started writing in order to get my inside world out.
Mm.
So again, writing for me was very significant. And but I burned most of my early stuff because I was afraid my dad would find them.
You like literally, you got rid of it.
Mhm.
Oh, if
I
we could
know.
only collect those ashes now.
I
Wouldn't that have
know.
been fun?
Wow.
Point one for writers, don't press delete. Like keep it, move it somewhere,
Yeah.
encrypt it, like whatever, but like don't make it go missing.
Yeah. My dad, it turns out, was a really good storyteller. And around especially children, he would weave combinations uh, of the old stories that you tell children, the fairy tales. At one point, I had found that he was working on online, back in the day, online was called a correspondence school where you wrote away, and he was learning the craft of writing Westerns. But I wasn't,
Really?
yeah, I was in high school and I was not allowed to go into his office. So I had to sneak in there and read these little beginnings of Westerns, and they were really good. He loved Western novels. And a few years ago, it was suddenly they disappeared. And one day I was talking to my dad and I said, by the way, whatever happened to those Westerns you were writing? And he gives me this look like, how in the world do you even know about them? And, for a second, I saw
Mm.
a little fire that was inside of him, but only for a second. And then it went out. And he,
Mhm.
he turned to me and he said, oh, they were just garbage.
Mm.
And the fire was out.
Oh, I that's such a loss for us. All those well-known stories of young people and to say they want to be singers and artists and all that, then they get a couple years on them, then they lose that ambition. I want to have for those that were faith guides your steps, that idea of Paul to Timothy to fan the flames of this unique gift that God has given you. And you fanned the flames, even though you had a relatively ordinary job at the time. Do I have that right? Were you riding the shack kind of to and from work?
I had three ordinary jobs at the same time. So what happened was, um, I never felt healthy enough to write.
Mm.
And so I slowly started writing gifts and poetry and some songs and things like that, and gifts for friends and family. And but that was all. I didn't take it beyond that. So during an 11-year journey of trying to figure out who I was and deal with my history, and it took an 11-year journey. Kim, that's the woman I am married to, and who saved my life. Kim started saying, someday as a gift for our kids, would you just write something that puts in one place how you think, because you think
Mm.
outside the box? And later she told me she was thinking like 4 to 6 pages, but she had not made that clear at the time. So
Awesome.
the year I turned 50, I finally realized that I was one of the healthiest people that I knew. I didn't have
Mm.
any addictions left. I had no secrets. I'd finally learned what it was like to be a child, because my childhood had been wrecked. And joy had become a constant companion. I finally was the same person in every situation. All of these, I knew what it was like to live inside the grace of just one day. So all of these showed up right when I turned 50, the 12th year. And I thought, you know what? I'm finally healthy enough to write something as a gift for my kids. And we were, people would say we were really poor. At the time, I was working 3 jobs. Kim walked down the street 2 blocks and got a job at the high school bakery. And we were renting a little tiny place on the corner of 12th Street. And joy had dropped on us like a ton of bricks.
Mm.
And we had pretty much lost everything, which was part of the journey of learning how to trust. And it was way down. It was right in the 11th year that I ran into the fear of financial insecurity. And that I had to go. And we ended up in that journey. It's a long story, but losing most of the material things in our lives. And it was one of the greatest liberating experiences of our life. It was a hard transition, but my kids would tell you, Kim would say, I'd tell you that the 2.5 years we spent at that little tiny house on the corner of 12th Street were among the best of our lives.
Mm.
And we had nothing. So I had nothing to give the kids for Christmas that year, literally. And so I started writing this story, on the train to one of my jobs, on the backs of grocery bags. And it just was like I had stepped into a river that had been waiting for 50 years.
Mm.
And I got it done. And at Christmas, I gotten a little bit of money, and I went down to Office Depot in Gresham, Oregon, and printed 15 copies on their photocopier.
Wow.
Jack, because you get a price break at 15. And and across the street was Kinko's, who were a little bit more expensive. So 15 copies, 6 went to the kids, and Kim and I kept one, and the extras I just gave to my friends, and I went back to work. Never crossed
Wow.
my mind to publish it or any of that, because that was a world that I never even had rubbed shoulders with.
Mm.
And those 15 copies did everything that I ever wanted that book to do.
Mm.
And so, my identity surely wasn't in that book. And that's something that we could talk about that is so important. And that is, don't lock your identity into anything that you can produce.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so my friends started giving it to their friends, and we put a little collection together, made 15 more copies at Office Depot, and so they could give it to their friends. I start getting emails from people that I didn't know who were telling me their great sadness stories.
Mm.
And it was holy ground stuff. And I had no idea how to respond to them. And I'd actually met a for real author. He needed a driver. And so one Saturday, I drove him all over parts of Portland area and down the Columbia River to Multnomah Falls and all of that. And so he was the only one I'd ever met. And so I sent him a note saying, how do you answer these emails? And he's like, sends me an email back. Why are they writing you? Well, I wrote this story for my kids. What is it? So I sent it to him, and he immediately does the author thing, like, well, it might take me 6 months to get around. And, I told my professor in college that he told me that to at least read 20 pages of anything anybody sent to him.
Mm.
You'd know in 20 pages.
Mm.
And he said, so some point in the next 6 months, I'll read part of it and 20 pages. And that was on a Friday night. Monday, he phones me, which he had never done.
This is awesome.
What were you thinking sending me that manuscript? And I'm like backing up in the basement among the clothes that were hanging up. And I said, just throw it out. I thought I had really offended him. And he goes, no, you don't understand. I can't print the pages fast enough.
Wow.
And he says, I haven't read anything like this. And who knows, the last couple decades where my first thought is, I've got friends that I need to send this to like right now.
Wow.
I don't care. Send it to whoever you want. He said, I already did. And
Unbelievable.
so that started a conversation. They wanted to make it into a movie right off the bat. And so in those conversations, we decided it would be good to publish it. And there were so many things that I didn't know, like, the average book only sells 3,000 to 4,000 copies in its entire existence. And if you can get to 6,000 copies, you have a bestseller. Less than 0.5% of all books makes it to 50,000. And I didn't know any of that, but I'm like on a day-by-day adventure, so who cares, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, all the things that were in place that mattered to me, they were already there by the time I wrote The Shack. Identity, worth, value, significance, security, meaning, purpose, destiny, community, love, all in place.
And I think for writers that are listening, that if you're on this journey, you can explore where you are on some of those questions about security and destiny and who you are. So don't think of those as impediments. As soon as I get a beat on that, then I'll start putting pen to paper, but to just let people know the things that you're figuring out in real time. Kim, I have a question for you. What are the things that you find writers bumping up against that are in a similar situation to Kim, but to Paul? And how do you encourage them to push through it?
Wow, I just love being the eavesdropper of this conversation. I'm learning so much. And Paul, I'm a fan of yours, and I loved meeting you in person a while back in Canada. But I would love for you to actually speak into this. Bob's question about how do we help people kind of move into maybe some tricky spots, either in the writing or what they're living. And you said a little while ago that you read classics growing up. Reading and writing for you were kind of an escape, and kind of at the beginning, a way for you to kind of, and they still are for me, a great space for me to kind of set aside some other things, move into the good stuff. And then I see that in your writing, that you do that you kind of build a world that will allow people to kind of put their shoulders down and enter into some bigger, richer conversations. But to Bob's point, how do we know when we're ready to move from the hard into putting these things down on paper? And I'm wondering, when you said, please don't confuse anything you produce with who you are. I would love for you to dovetail back for that, because Bob's asking about how we do that as fellow writers and as coaches, and man, that's tricky. That's tricky stuff. When this is different than doing your taxes, people. When you send your things into your CPA or you do it yourself, those are just numbers. That does not feel personal to me. But if I submit pages of writing to people, and definitely people I care about, I feel very vulnerable. So how do you disentangle that? We talk a lot in coaching about how what you're writing, what you're doing, that's not all of who you are. It's a part of your experience, but that's not you. And it sounds like you've had to ask those questions yourself. So I'm punting what Bob asked me and wanting you to speak into that, because you've had to ask that question many, many times, I think, in your career. How do you not confuse what you make with who you are?
I asked that question many, many times before I wrote
Uh-huh.
Jack.
Okay.
And it had to be a journey that was resolved to a
Mm,
great degree, because if I'd written the shack, which I couldn't have, but say that I wrote the shack in my 30s, it would have killed me.
yeah.
It would have absolutely taken me apart. And because at that time I still lived out of a persona where the outside defined how I was going to respond.
Mm,
So my false persona was based on who the audience was. When I said
mm,
that, when I realized that I was healthy, I said this one line, and that I had learned to become the same person in every situation, right? So I lived
mhm.
from the inside out, and I knew who I was on the inside. And this may be a little scary, but I think that God often gives visions of outcomes to us in order to kill us,
Mm,
in order to raise to the surface the things that need to be healed. There is this phrase in Acts 17 that says, "This is not a God who can be served by human hands as if he needed anything." And a lot of my people, a lot of the people who talk to me about writing, it really comes down to they don't know who they are, and they feel safer attaching the outcome to God, right?
mm-hmm,
So I'm
mm-hmm.
doing this for God.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. And so I have a friend of mine in the music business a long time ago, Christian music business, who was, he would tell you, not one of his best moments, but he had been pursued by this one person, this young man who really believed that he had the song that would change the world, right? And so it was about the mission and about the vision. And so he would walk right into his office that was on X floor in Nashville, Tennessee. And finally he said, "All right, I'll listen to it." And so he had the guy wait out in the outside room. He listened to it, and he walked back out to him and he said, "All right, I've listened to it." And he said, "But I think I know why God gave this song to you. It was because he didn't want it."
Oh, gosh.
You know, one of the things that I want to just pause on that for a second as you writers, one thing that's true of many years of knowing you, Paul, you're wonderfully disruptive in the most reverent way. You take some of the things that we think, and then you just say like the things that are so invitational, they cause you pause for a moment, and then there's this explanation, and people go, yes, like find that gear, people that are listening, where you can say, not to say things to be disruptive for the purpose of being disruptive,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
but to say, can we take a fresh look at a familiar idea and maybe find the layer underneath that?
mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
by turning that rock over, we can find some truth. Would you say that's kind of like a part of what you do, to say, let's take this thing as generally accepted and see what's on the other side of that?
I think that was an invitation to Kim to respond to that.
No, that's you.
Oh,
That's you. I
yeah.
think it's just seeing what's underneath that.
Of course, because the beauty of who you are, the uniqueness of who you are is an embodied uniqueness. It started at the point of conception and has continued to expand because you have a human nature, which we all share, and it's in union with the very fullness of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. But the uniqueness of who you are is your embodiment. And but you've got to find your identity itself in the reality of this union with the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, not in your embodiment.
Mm,
So so when I say that the verse says, "This is not a God who needs anything," as if, who can be served by human hands. that's to free you up so that you're not under the jurisdiction of a imprisonment for production. Because anything that you believe to be your identity that can be taken away from you is false. And you cannot build your place there. I know a lot of people who want to be a writer that cannot put a pen to paper because they're afraid that it will be less than perfect. They want to write the final product, and you cannot do that. It's impossible. And they want to write it in isolation without, Kim, you were saying about the beauty of the interaction of relationship that will then help you form the beauty of what you're presenting. So I have a phrase that is trust the ripples, right? Do the next right thing and trust the ripples, right? Because you don't make your decisions based on outcomes. And I think that's especially true if you write fiction or you write music, the more artistic forms. Nonfiction has its rules, and you can write it very creatively, and it needs to be written creatively. But there are really no rules about nonfiction. When you work on art, and sadly, Christians have left the risk of art to move into propaganda. And they destroyed the art when they turned it into an agenda driven. They're not trusting what they're writing. And you had a whole series historically not long ago with the Inklings, Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, and then G.K. Chesterton and George MacDonald before that, where you had people that were able to move between the worlds easily. And so you didn't have that sense of propaganda. When you think that God requires a certain outcome, you won't do well in terms of art. When you do nonfiction, you actually are creating a world that's the inside of that is bigger than the outside. And you're creating a space for people to hear for themselves. So it's very respectful. And where nonfiction, you're trying to close space down so that somebody understands what you understand. Fiction is like wide open. So, that's why people can say, well, they got things out of my book that I never wrote.
Yes. Isn't that true? People said, oh, I saw exactly what you were doing there. I'm like, dude, sounds like a great idea. Yeah, sure. Let's go with that one.
Yeah. So, and why? And people will say that to me. I've read this book 10 times and I never saw that. Why? And I'm saying, because you moved. You're looking at the same mountain, but you're moving. And so it looks different every time you move. So the element of trusting the ripples is you participate here. And this goes to the relationship of trust with God in every sphere of our lives, right? You participate in the moment in response to what is in front of you, and you trust the ripples. But so many people that I know that talk about these things, they don't trust the outcomes unless they meet their expectations. And expectations are just disappointments waiting to happen, I love the editing process and I hate the editing process. When I wrote Eve, I edited out 40,000 words.
Oh my goodness. Oh my gosh.
Inside the relationship and we had 4 editors.
Oh my goodness. If you want to get inside Paul Young's mind, read the book Eve,
That's awesome.
which is so great. I'm just delighting here. I'm just secretly bubbling up because even people that know this lodge of ours burned to the ground and then we've just built it again. There was this big, important decision that we had to make when we were redoing it to make this one part exactly like it was before. I kid you not, Paul. It's because Sweet Maria said, this is where Paul and I would sit at the kitchen while I was working on things and he would talk to me. And isn't that beautiful to have that kind of legacy? Like this is just like Paul's place. And I just love for you as you're listening to this to just know that there's so many layers to people and there's so many layers to you. And let's go do a little spelunking and get to the deeper levels of who you are. Turn on the headlight, see what's been written on the walls, see what needs to be erased, see what needs to be written over. and to write into that. This is so beautiful, Paul. I'm just sitting here just delighting in this.
Well, you
Um,
and I and Kim, I know your hearts, and we want people to be free. We don't want
Mhm.
them just to be channeled into an outcome,
Mm.
right? Because so many of us bring our garbage to that journey, and it's the unexposed is the unhealed. It has to be exposed.
Mm.
And this journey, like writing or art in general, we are always on edge. If we don't know who we are, if we are responding to the audience, we are always on edge to hear what they're saying. When I was a teenager, I was very, very good in terms of piano, very good. But I was always on edge. 2 years in a row, I came in second at major music festivals, of which there were equivalent like Juilliard responses if you
Mm.
want, right? And I came in second 2 years in a row, and I would puke my
Mm.
guts out for a week.
Mm.
And I was at risk if anybody had pointed out, something that was not perfect.
Yeah.
I was lost. I
Mm.
was lost. And that means I really didn't know who I was. And the crazy thing, I froze when it came to terms with playing music in for the church. I couldn't do it. I could not sight read. I could memorize Tchaikovsky's sonata in A minor, right? But
Mm.
I couldn't play a hymn. And so there were so many
Wow.
conflict issues that were going on for me because I had no idea who I was.
yeah, it's
Mm.
kind of like the difference between a recital, doing life that way, or playing good jazz. Like you just tap your feet and go where the music takes you.
Yeah.
For
Mm.
some people, and like you, I think my goal has changed. I want to be famous with my family these days. And so we took all the kids to Disneyland and the grandkids, and we took them on the Pirates of the Caribbean. And some of these kids are just 3 or 4 feet tall. But I thought, it's just like we sit on these bench seats and you go through. But we got stuck. The ride broke for like an hour at a really scary place.
Oh
They're going to have some serious couch time after this. And the reason I mention that is that sometimes in our writing, we get stuck at one moment in our life rather than looking at all that led up to it and all that's in front of that.
no.
And
Mm.
so I would say, as a writer, don't get stuck. There might
Mm.
be a big inciting incident in your life. There are these things, but just to write to what got you there and write to what you anticipate will follow.
Yeah. And if you're at peace with yourself, there's no need to hurry.
Mm.
There just isn't. I've got some work that have been sitting for 15 years. I also have worked projects where suddenly there's a big space. And I look back and I realize now that I needed to learn some things so that the craft that I was creating was actually so much better than it would have been if I had been in a hurry. And and to know that God doesn't need my worship, God doesn't need my praise, God doesn't need my prayers, God doesn't need my art, God doesn't need my writing. God never will use us. Never, because that's an abuse language, right? To say, well, God is using me. I would never say that to my
Mm.
child. Oh, I can't wait for you to grow up so you can be a tool that I can use.
Mm.
I mean, that's abuse.
Mm.
And so instead of that, it's an invitation to participate.
Mhm.
So there's a constant invitation to participate. And that only happens moment by moment, right? So we get to experience life as it unfolds, we get to respond to it, and then we trust the ripples.
Mm.
Now, if we define the ripples as certain kinds of outcomes, then they've turned into expectations and we're going to be disappointed. But that's where fear comes in. The reason that fear pushes us in terms of what we create is because we have changed outcomes into expectations. And those fears can be a myriad, right? They can be the fear of not being enough, the fear of not being perfect, the fear of not having money, right? If you like, I had no idea. I finally was content with my life working 3 manual labor jobs, and I was content. I I had the relationships around me that I was content in. And I thought, all right, this is what I'm going to do potentially the rest of my life. And I'm good with it. Some months we had $12 in the bank. Some months we had $45 in the bank. And literally the year I gave the shack to my kids for Christmas, it was my only present.
Mm.
And and it was wonderful. And it wasn't based on their response to it, which was, oh, a book. Thanks, Dad. You know, some of them didn't even read it for 6 to 8 months, and it took Kim over a year. You know, when when she read Crossroads, she said, "I like this so much better than
Oh,
and and she said that Chad, our oldest, she says after she reads The Shack, she goes, "What's everybody so excited about?" And Chad
so
says,
awesome.
she said, "Mom, you got to remember that we grew up inside this kind of thinking, and so it's not a huge surprise to us."
Mm.
Yeah.
And so, but again, if I'm at risk for somebody's response,
Right.
that tells me that there's some work here that needs done.
Yeah.
That's why I said God doesn't need us, and sometimes he gives us a vision in order to do some eternal work. The existence of the shack is temporary. A lot of healing in terms of physical healing is temporary. Raising from the dead is temporary. So what would you choose? Would you choose something that is temporary over something that is eternal? The transformation of a human life, the transformation of your ability to love, those are eternal, and so suddenly now there can be fun in this because I'm not at risk,
That's it.
right? And it's not dependent on the outcomes. What if the outcome is only that it touches one person? Is that enough? What if the one person is me? Is that enough? And you know what? It's enough.
Yeah.
I look at what's happened with the shack or any of the stuff that I do, and it's as surreal to me today as it's ever been. I feel like I'm sitting up in the cheap seats going like, thank you, Holy Spirit. We will have more, please. And it's incredible. It's incredible to watch this thing, but I'm not embedded in it. If it all went away tomorrow, all of it, I'd be absolutely fine. I'd be great.
Yeah.
And it would be just a joy to, I've got 17 grandkids now.
Yeah. Come on.
You know,
Here's some people.
oh,
Well,
but
this
they're
is
eternal.
the conversation I want to go on for 5 or 6 episodes. But I hope as you're listening to this is kind of whet your appetite when we get a community of people together at a place up in Canada. What we do is we don't give name tags. We don't introduce people by what they do and their accomplishments and all that. And so I remember Paul standing up at one of the breakfasts, I think, to give a thought. And here's people that go like, I wonder who that guy is. It did not think of like tens of billions of books. But they just received what we have. And sometimes the gift we can give people is this gift of not knowing the celebrity, but they actually hearing our heart, because some of the other stuff can get in the way. So as you're thinking about penning your words, just delight in the fact that God is going to use you in this unique time in this adventure. And it isn't that you're writing to somebody who you think will be a fan someday. Just you're writing, to your point, Paul, to yourself. You're capturing these ideas. You're netting the butterflies. And I hope what you've heard, if you have been among the many who've read any of Paul's books, and there's so many of them, that there's so many layers to this man, and there can be so many to you. So it isn't just the person in the kitchen and making the cookies and all that, but there's a lot of layers beneath that. And you don't need to say all those. We don't need to show people our depth, but that we can actually give them the freedom to find their depth.
Yeah.
Hey,
It's
Kim, will you?
important to learn the craft.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
important.
So
Yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah.
Kim, one last word to you. send our writers off into the world to get some words shit written down.
Man, I mean, first, how about you just push rewind? Do we still do that on phones? Rewind, listen to the
Yes.
whole darn thing over again. And I would just love to underscore what both Bob and Paul have said, that this is an invitation. There's no mandate here. You aren't forced into writing anything, but gosh, what a beauty and what a privilege to say I'm going to be on this road with other friends who love me and with the God who made me and who writes and tells and lives the best stories. What a beautiful way to think about that instead of having some sort of, again, this expectation that really requires you to control the universe. I don't recommend it. I've never been able to do it, and I've tried a few times. Instead, how about just the invitation to sit down, take some time to write? Maybe it's on a grocery bag. Worked for Paul. I don't see why it won't work for you. Get after it because you're the one who can write your layered, multi-layered, beautiful story. You're the one for that job.
And I love the Christmas story there, Paul. We have a tradition at our place. Yeah, we call it a flat Christmas around our house. And the only gift that I can receive is flat. It can be a photograph, it can be a poem, it can be a
That's
story.
beautiful.
Yeah,
Isn't that
it's got to be
great?
flat Christmas.
I
Love it.
love it. If your motivation is fear, you're not free.
Mhm.
Yeah, good
And
words.
when you become more yourself, then your voice is available to the world because
Mhm.
every human being is a story.
Mhm.
And whether it's you're doing it on a piece of art and whether it's painting or sculpture or dance or whatever, the more you're free to be yourself, the more available to some aspect of the universe that someone else has never experienced,
How about that?
right?
Yeah.
It's stunning.
Unbelievable.
It's absolutely stunning.
Mhm.
So good. Well, you were a man of the cloth without the cloth, but with a pen.
Thank you. And one day I will not be able to hold one. And so it was never my identity. Yeah.
Yes,
Mhm.
bingo. There we go. Well, you guys, you've been listening to the writing room. I hope this has been one that has been as memorable for you as it is for me, because you've been listening to a voice I trust. There's Paul has a big voice, not only in my life, but in Sweet Maria's life as well. I mean, we've got a whole part of our house built to stage just in case Paul comes back to talk a little bit more. All right, you
Thank you.
guys. Now
Love you, Kimberly.
go ahead and take something that Kim or Paul said and don't just agree with them because Jesus never asks anybody to agree with him. Go do something about it. Take your first bold move and don't despise these small beginnings. Zechariah 4:10. The Lord delights in watching the work begin. All right, you guys. We'll talk to you again next week.
Much love.